Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are setting our sights on a claim that is absolutely foundational to a major American faith tradition, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It's a
Mm-hmm.
belief that has been, instilled from childhood, sung in primary, and really ingrained in the institutional culture.
It's powerful.
It is.
Yeah.
We're talking about the complex and, frankly, highly sensitive doctrine that the prophet can never lead the church astray.
And this is it's a crucial historical undertaking for the learner joining us. I think it's important to state right up front that our mission here is strictly analytical.
Right.
We're not here to evaluate the validity of the belief itself. What we're doing is tracing the exact historical, political, and, theological origins of this statement as it's presented in the sources you've shared with us.
Exactly. Our goal is to connect the dots.
Yes. To show how this doctrine emerged directly, as a necessary defense mechanism during what was arguably the most acute institutional crisis of the 19th century, the forced abandonment of polygamy.
That's the key here. We are treating this body of work like a historical puzzle. We're going to unpack the intense pressures of the 1880s, the stark contradictions it presented to prior prophetic teachings.
Which are significant.
Oh, incredibly significant.
Fair.
And the resulting logical architecture, specifically this idea of circular reasoning that was required to manage that massive theological U-turn. This is all about historical mechanics, delivered with the clarity you need to grasp these really profound shifts.
And what's so fascinating to me is how the entire question of authority, modern authority in the church, pivots on this one claim.
Right.
And how recently, in the grand scope of history, it was actually formalized. By examining the context of 1890, we can better understand the burden of prophecy and, maybe more importantly, the spiritual responsibility that's placed on the individual.
Okay, so let's start there. Let's begin by just acknowledging the immense cultural importance of this claim. Our sources refer to this idea, the prophet's inability to err in leading the church, as a sacred cow.
And that's the perfect term for it. It's internalized far beyond just being some, official policy statement. It's part of the emotional and spiritual landscape of the faith.
And you can see how deeply it's been institutionalized over time.
Absolutely. The sources highlight what seems like a minor detail, but it's incredibly telling. The song Follow the Prophet.
The one every child learns.
That one, yes. It was added to the children's songbook by specific request as recently as 1987.
1987. That's much more recent than I would have thought.
It is. And what that means is that the message of trusting and following the leader, without question, is being deliberately transmitted from the earliest possible age. It establishes a culture of institutional loyalty before a child even begins to encounter complex history or, difficult questions.
If that concept is being taught in the nursery, that sets up an extraordinary expectation for infallibility later in life.
Of course.
And that brings us to what our source says is a critical need for clarity. If we don't define our terms, we are setting ourselves, or any learner, up for, profound disillusionment and cognitive dissonance down the road.
Yes, and we have to define what seems, on the surface, to be undefinable. If we accept the premise that the prophet can never lead us astray, we have to ask the next logical question. What does led astray actually mean?
Right. Does it mean led into doctrinal error? Or does it mean bad financial advice? Or political advice?
Exactly. And our material points out this crucial ambiguity. There is, and this is a quote, no common understanding of what it entails. And the reason for that is simple. The institution itself hasn't told us exactly what that means.
So that absence of a clear definition is incredibly revealing. It leaves the burden of interpretation entirely on the follower. You have to decide for yourself how far that protective bubble of infallibility extends.
And that ambiguity, as the sources state very clearly, is where the spiritual danger lurks. The culturally interpreted idea of infallibility, which is often far, far broader than any formal definition would ever be, is deemed spiritually dangerous.
Why dangerous?
Because it encourages followers to, and again I'm quoting, equate the leaders of the church with God.
So instead of using the prophet as a guide to connect with God, the leader becomes the spiritual destination himself.
Precisely. When the leader's counsel, or even just his human opinion on a matter, is treated with the weight of direct revelation, you've essentially swapped out personal confirmation for institutional obedience. The process gets short-circuited.
That's the transfer of authority our source talks about. The spiritual burden transfers from the individual, who is supposed to pray, study, and receive their own confirmation, to the institution, whose pronouncements must be accepted without reserve.
And that is the foundation that Wilford Woodruff was trying to establish when he made the original claim back in 1890.
Let's pinpoint that origin. The sources are so precise on this. The belief originated in 1890. This was not an ancient teaching. It wasn't a founding tenet of the faith.
No, it was a response to an immediate existential crisis. It was delivered when Wilford Woodruff issued Official Declaration 1, or OD1, which formally suspended the practice of plural marriage within the United States.
This declaration was the institutional pivot point.
It was. And the accompanying statement on prophetic infallibility was the theological justification required for that pivot. It was the cover.
And we have the specific, incredibly powerful language Woodruff used in his October 1890 address.
Yes, it's worth hearing the whole thing. He said, "The Lord will never permit me or any other man who stands as president of this church to lead you astray. It is not in the program. It is not in the mind of God."
It is not in the program. That's such a strange, almost corporate phrase.
It is, he continues. "If I were to attempt that, the Lord would remove me out of my place, and so he will any other man who attempts to lead the children of men astray from the oracles of God and from their duty."
That is a stunning claim of a self-guarantee, a divine safety net.
It is. But when you look at that statement critically, what really stands out is the logical construction, or, as our source material identifies it, the logical flaw.
The circular reasoning critique. Let's break down exactly why this statement is considered circular and why that matters so much for a foundational doctrine.
Well, circular reasoning, at its core, means the argument presupposes what it's attempting to prove. The premise and the conclusion are essentially the same statement, just rephrased.
So, in this case,
Mm-hmm.
the prophet can never lead us astray because the prophet who can never lead us astray told us so.
Exactly. The prophet is reliable because the prophet says he is reliable, and we know we must trust him because he is the prophet. It's a closed loop. There's no way in from the outside with evidence.
It's the ultimate self-executing authority. It doesn't rely on external evidence or prior historical proofs. You have to first accept the infallibility of the speaker before you can accept the content of his speech.
Which just so happens to be about his own infallibility. And our sources really emphasize this crucial lack of an external foundation. When Woodruff delivered this speech in 1890, he did not cite an ancient scriptural precedent. He didn't reference an earlier prophetic vision or a revelation that guaranteed this inability to err.
He wasn't saying, as it says in the Book of Mormon, or as Joseph Smith taught.
No, he was creating a monumental, church-altering claim based solely on the authority of his office in that very moment of crisis.
So the doctrine that has since become the bedrock of institutional loyalty, this idea that the current leader can never err, was established purely by the current leader asserting his own unassailable authority. That tells you everything you need to know about the desperate nature of the crisis they were facing.
It absolutely does. And to truly gauge the revolutionary nature of that 1890 statement, we have to contrast it with the preceding 60 years of teachings from the founding leaders.
Okay, so let's go back. Part 2, before the crisis.
Right. The source material reveals a consistent, powerful strain of warning against the exact type of blind obedience that the 1890 doctrine would later encourage.
Let's start at the beginning then, with Joseph Smith himself. The record from Eliza R. Snow's journal gives us this powerful insight into the danger Smith saw in over-reliance on a single spiritual intermediary.
He was, it seems, deeply concerned about spiritual complacency. He taught the Relief Society that the people were depending on the prophet, hence they were darkened in their minds.
Darkened in their minds?
Yes, in consequence of neglecting the duties devolving upon themselves.
So darkened in their minds is a profound spiritual consequence for just outsourcing your revelation. It suggests that your personal growth, your direct connection with God, is stunted when you simply wait for a leader to deliver marching orders.
It creates a dangerous spiritual apathy. The founder's focus, at least in this instance, was on leading people to Christ, not standing in his place. It's the difference between a guide who shows you the path up the mountain so you can meet the Lord for yourself,
Right.
versus a gatekeeper who just stands at the bottom and only brings messages back down.
That model aligns with the desire of prophets throughout history. Our sources cite the example of Moses, who desperately wanted the people of Israel to ascend Mount Sinai and meet with God directly. He didn't want to be the only one.
Exactly. His famous wish was, "Would to God that all the Lord's people were prophets." This reflects an ideal of universal spiritual capacity, not an exclusive, centralized authority that is somehow immune to error.
But the warnings weren't just about general spiritual laziness, were they? They were explicit about the potential for those holding the priesthood, even in high office, to actively mislead people.
They were, and this is where it gets very pointed. The sources bring up an unsigned article, which is generally attributed to Joseph Smith with some input from others.
Okay.
And it pulls no punches. It says that men can dishonor that priesthood by using the influence which they have gained to lead others astray.
So the implication is crystal clear.
No.
Having authority does not confer infallibility. In fact, the trust followers place in a leader can be exploited to lead them into error.
And the accompanying critique of blind obedience in that same article is perhaps the most forceful contradiction to the 1890 statement that you can find. The article declares, quote, "None are required to tamely and blindly submit to a man because he has a portion of the priesthood."
Tamely and blindly submit.
Yes. And it goes on. The consequence of following counsel that you know is wrong is described in these searing terms. It says that obedience, when you know something is wrong, is worse than folly to us. It is slavery in the extreme.
Slavery in the extreme. That language is essential. It frames unquestioning obedience as a moral and spiritual degradation. It strips individual of their agency, of their spiritual accountability.
It places the individual conscience above the institutional decree, which is the exact opposite of the doctrine that was developed later out of necessity.
And if the individual must ultimately render a faithful account of his stewardship, as that article states, then the follower has to bear the consequence of being led astray, even if the error originated with a leader.
The blame might be shared, but the spiritual and temporal ruin is personal. You still have to answer for it.
To illustrate this principle, the sources point to a major historical crisis that happened decades before 1890, the failure of the Kirtland Safety Society in 1837.
This is a profound moment, a real complication when it comes to prophetic financial counsel.
Let's unpack the Kirtland failure, because it seems to be a perfect case study of individuals bearing the consequences of prophetic counsel that has gone wrong.
The situation was dire. Joseph Smith was facing severe economic hardship for the church and its members. So he sought to establish a quasi-bank, the Kirtland Safety Society.
Okay.
Now, crucially, the sources record Smith claiming he was told by an audible voice that the society would succeed. So this wasn't just, a good business idea. This was presented and treated as revealed financial counsel.
So members were encouraged to invest.
Heavily. Many liquidated their existing assets, sold farms, homes to buy stock in this divinely endorsed venture.
And what happened?
It failed spectacularly. It collapsed amidst the national financial panic of 1837, and many faithful members lost everything. Not just their invested capital, but their homes, their land, their entire financial futures. They were ruined.
And they were ruined despite the fact that the counsel to invest came with this solemn guarantee of prophetic success.
Yes. Those who followed the counsel still bore the crushing, devastating financial consequences of its failure.
That directly undermines the simplistic modern cultural interpretation that if you follow counsel, you'll always be blessed or shielded from negative consequences.
It does.
In Kirtland, many people were financially led astray, and the consequences were catastrophic.
Yeah.
It led to a massive wave of apostasy and a lot of ill will toward Joseph Smith.
It proved very early on that even when counsel is believed to be directly revealed, the principle of personal accountability and the subsequent earthly consequences remains absolute. You can't outsource that risk.
And these warnings against this kind of dependency, they continued directly into the Brigham Young era.
Oh, yes. He seems to have foreseen the exact spiritual danger that the 1890 doctrine would later create and codify.
How so?
He was keenly aware of the human tendency towards spiritual laziness. Young famously stated, and this is a quote you see often, "I'm more afraid that this people have so much confidence in their leaders that they will not inquire for themselves of God whether they are led by him."
That is a staggering admission from a leader who wielded immense power. He was worried that his own authority might become a stumbling block for his followers.
He feared they would settle down into a state of blind self-security, trusting their destiny in the hands of their leaders with a reckless confidence.
Reckless confidence. That phrase perfectly describes the psychological state that the 1890 claim that the prophet cannot err was designed to produce.
It's the exact same concept.
So if Brigham Young saw the danger of blind trust so clearly, how did the church culture so rapidly transition from seek personal revelation first to follow the current voice no matter what in just a few decades?
Well, the answer, as we're going to see, is necessity. Pure, desperate necessity. But Young even went further than just warning about complacency. He introduced the terrifying possibility that errors could be divinely sanctioned as a test of faith.
What do you mean?
He warned that if the people would not have truth, they would have error sent unto them, and they would believe it.
So God would actually allow error to come through the channels of authority if the people weren't diligent enough to discern it for themselves.
Precisely. He even stated that God would suffer the devil to give revelations that they, priests and people, would follow after. This pre-1890 view holds the people, the followers, completely responsible for discerning truth, even if the error originates at the very top.
That sets up the utter magnitude of the theological reversal that Wilford Woodruff had to enact. He wasn't just changing a policy, he was flipping the entire model of spiritual accountability on its head.
Absolutely. And that brings us to the crisis itself. Part 3. We have to fully grasp the theological gravity of polygamy before 1890. Without this context, Woodruff's decision to abandon it seems merely political or pragmatic.
But the sources show it was a complete reversal of the very mechanism of exaltation.
That's the key. This was the universal, indispensable teaching for 40 years, from its public introduction in 1852 until the crisis of 1890. The sources are clear that every single leader taught that the patriarchal order of marriage, or polygamy, was the eternal law of God.
And not just eternal, but essential. It could and would never be rescinded. This wasn't an optional practice.
Not at all. This was the foundation of exaltation. If you wanted to become a god, as is taught in their theology, you had to embrace this principle. There was no other way.
Brigham Young articulated this connection between plural marriage and ultimate godhood with stunning clarity, didn't he? Back in 1852.
He did. He declared, quote, "Without the doctrine that this revelation reveals, no man on earth could be exalted to be a god."
That's about as direct as it gets.
He went on to cement the doctrine, saying the only men who become gods are those who enter into polygamy. And to be absolutely explicit, he even used the famous parable of the talents to underscore the danger of monogamy.
How did that work?
A man with only one wife, he warned, was like the man with the one talent in the parable. And just like that talent was taken away, he would lose his one wife in heaven.
And she would be given to whom?
She would be transferred, as he put it, to a man who had been faithful to the plural marriage principle and had many wives.
That raises the stakes to the absolute maximum. Rejection of the principle isn't just disobedience, it's rejection of your eternal life and your godhood.
It's the rejection of your eternal family.
So with consequences this high, it's no wonder the subsequent warnings of damnation and apostasy were so severe.
The leaders spoke with absolute certainty that reversing this principle would bring spiritual ruin to the entire institution. You look at Heber C. Kimball's ultimatum in 1856. He made it impossible to separate polygamy from the entire faith.
What did he say?
He said, "You might as well deny Mormonism as turn away from it, as to oppose the plurality of wives."
So polygamy is Mormonism. To him, they were one and the same.
They were inextricable. And then came the explicit warning about the leadership, which is just chilling in hindsight. He said, "Let the presidency and all the authorities unite and say with one voice that they will oppose that doctrine, and the whole of them would be damned."
The whole of them would be damned.
Yes, that is a prophet betting his own salvation and the salvation of all the other leaders on the permanence of this one doctrine. When Woodruff issued OD1, he was enacting the very scenario that Kimball had prophesied would result in the collective damnation of the leadership.
And John Taylor provided similar warnings in 1866, right? He focused not just on individual damnation, but on total institutional collapse.
Yes, Taylor's argument was that if the church did not proceed with polygamy, it would lose its divine authority. The keys of the kingdom would be taken away.
And to members in the 1860s, losing the keys meant the end of everything.
It meant the complete cessation of valid ordinances. No more valid baptisms, endowments, temple marriages. It meant a complete institutional apostasy. The church would cease to be God's church on earth.
So he wasn't just warning individuals against sin. He was warning the organization against spiritual extinction.
Correct. And he explicitly stated that anyone opposing the principle was on the high road to apostasy.
This institutional commitment was then reinforced by the senior apostle, Orson Pratt.
And his condemnation was arguably the most sweeping of all. In 1874, he stated that rejecting polygamy was an absurdity. An absurdity that necessitated rejecting Mormonism, Joseph Smith, Book of Mormon, Book of Covenants, and the whole system.
Hold on. Rejecting one practice meant you had to reject the Book of Mormon itself. That's an astonishing theological scope for a single doctrine.
It shows you how deeply intertwined the doctrine had become with the entire Restoration theology. To Pratt, you couldn't pick and choose. Polygamy was the linchpin. If you pulled it out, the whole structure collapsed.
And did he issue a personal warning as well?
Oh, yes. Pratt prophesied that those who oppose it will find themselves in darkness until they will finally go down to hell and be damned if they do not repent. The message from every corner, from every leader, was unequivocally clear. This principle must be defended and practiced at all costs.
And we can't forget Wilford Woodruff's own pre-1890 stance before he was president.
An excellent point. In 1869, Woodruff himself argued that doing away with polygamy meant doing away with the prophets and apostles with revelation and giving up our religion altogether.
So every single leader was on record, including the man who would eventually reverse it, stating that abandoning the principle was spiritual suicide.
This collective prophetic consistency is vital. You have to understand this to see the problem. When Woodruff issued OD1, he wasn't just changing a policy, he was reversing what was taught as an eternal prerequisite for godhood. And in doing so, he was contradicting 40 years of unified prophetic testimony, including his own.
And to defend this essential, eternal, unchangeable doctrine, the leaders often relied on some pretty interesting historical and philosophical arguments that condemned the alternative of monogamy.
Exactly. This was all happening against the political backdrop of the Republican Party fighting what are called the twin relics of barbarism, slavery, and polygamy.
Right.
So the defense required some theological and cultural gymnastics.
And Brigham Young repeatedly claimed that monogamy was, no part of the economy of heaven.
That's the phrase. He tied the origin of the one-man, one-woman system to violence and vice.
What was his argument?
Young's recurring claim, as detailed in our sources, was that the monogamic system began with wandering brigands and robbers who founded the Roman Empire.
Okay, so a very debased origin story.
Very. He alleged that they stole the Sabine women, and the resulting scarcity of women led to laws restricting men to only one wife.
So he was claiming that one of the foundations of Western civilization, monogamy, was rooted in theft and violence, and that this flawed foundation led to modern social ills.
He asserted that the monogamic system was actually a source of prostitution and whoredom throughout all the Christian monogamic cities. Essentially, he was defending polygamy as the morally superior, divinely sanctioned system necessary to prevent societal collapse.
You have to admire the logical stretch there, using a Roman foundation myth to condemn all of Western culture while simultaneously defending polygamy.
It's quite the argument.
And it's an argument that has permeated culture so thoroughly that our source even links this story of the Sabine women, these kidnapped women founding Rome, to the movie musical Seven Brides for Seven Brothers.
The irony is rich. But this entire theological and historical edifice, built up over 4 decades and backed by eternal warnings of damnation, this was what Wilford Woodruff had to dismantle, essentially overnight in 1890.
Which brings us to part 4, the 1890 shift and its legacy. Now we arrive at the crisis point that makes the creation of the infallibility doctrine understandable, if not logically sound.
Exactly. We have established that institutionally, abandoning polygamy meant apostasy and damnation, according to all prior prophets. But the external forces were more powerful than any theological certainty.
Describe that pressure. How bad was it?
It was existential. The U.S. government, primarily through the Edmunds-Tucker Act of 1887, was systematically destroying the church as a legal and financial entity.
So what did the act do, specifically?
It did several things at once. It dissolved the church's corporate existence. It disenfranchised all women and all polygamists so they couldn't vote. It made polygamy punishable by significant imprisonment.
And the property.
And most critically, it threatened the utter destruction of the church through the confiscation of virtually all its assets, over $50,000.
So the government was actively seizing temples, meeting houses, the general tithing office, huge swaths of land.
Everything. Woodruff was facing the very real prospect of the church losing its financial ability to function, its physical headquarters, and its most sacred spaces. They were about to lose it all.
It was an impossible dilemma.
It was. He had to choose between 2 catastrophic options. 1, adhere to 40 years of prophetic doctrine, which guaranteed institutional ruin and financial death at the hands of the government. Or 2, reject the essential, unchangeable doctrine of his predecessors and risk spiritual damnation and apostasy, just as they had all prophesied.
And he chose institutional survival.
He did. And to make that decision palatable to a membership that had been told for decades that this exact change meant damnation, He needed an immediate, powerful theological justification.
And that justification was the introduction of this new central doctrine.
The defensive mechanism,
Yeah.
the declaration that the Lord will never permit me to lead you astray, was the necessary philosophical tool to transition away from a central doctrine that had been taught as absolutely essential for exaltation.
So the message effectively shifted. It went from polygamy is essential for godhood and its abandonment means damnation to whatever the current prophet teaches is correct because God won't let him fail.
Exactly. It prioritized the authority of the current office over the content of past revelation. The position became more important than the principle.
And it had to. This profound shift created what our sources call a great divide. It separated the faithful into two camps based on what they prioritized.
The eternal, unchangeable doctrine of the past, or institutional loyalty to the present authority.
So on one side, you had those who chose past revelation. These are the fundamentalists who would eventually become groups like the FLDS. They saw the reversal as the church entering apostasy.
And you have to admit, they were being logically consistent. They were adhering precisely to the warnings of John Taylor and Orson Pratt, who said the keys would be lost and the church damned if polygamy was abandoned. For them, polygamy remained the central doctrine.
They chose historical prophetic certainty over institutional convenience.
Yes, and on the other side, you had the vast majority of members who stayed with the main body of the church.
And what did they adopt?
They adopted the new infallibility doctrine as their new core principle. Institutional loyalty to the current prophet became the non-negotiable virtue, regardless of how drastically the current teachings contradicted the past.
The doctrine of infallibility provided a shield then. It allowed followers to discard the inconvenient and, at that point, impossible to maintain eternal doctrines of the past without having to question the divine authority of the institution itself.
It became the ultimate tool for crisis management and for ensuring continuity.
What's surprising, though, is that even with this forceful declaration, the practice didn't just cease overnight. The confusion lingered for years.
That's a critical point to note. The source material confirms that even after OD1 in 1890, Wilford Woodruff and other leaders continued to authorize or at least allow the private practice of plural marriage, especially outside the U.S.
Why? If the revelation was to stop.
The government pressure was still intense, but the theological shift was just too radical for immediate, uniform adherence. You can't just undo 40 years of teaching that something is essential for salvation in a single speech.
So this inconsistency between the 1890 declaration and the continuing reality is what led directly to the need for a second, much harder stance in 1904, the Second Manifesto.
Yes, that was when they really started excommunicating people for it. And this lingering confusion demonstrates that the 1890 doctrine of infallibility didn't fully resolve the underlying theological paradox. The cognitive dissonance regarding the return of polygamy still exists in the culture today.
And we see that contradiction even in modern teachings.
We do. For instance, the late apostle Bruce R. McConkie, in his very influential work, Mormon Doctrine, explicitly stated that the holy practice will commence again after the second coming and the ushering in of the millennium.
So it's still an eternal principle, just on pause.
According to that interpretation, yes. But then, other modern leaders have suggested that the practice is permanently done, that it served its purpose and is over. So the foundational question, is polygamy essential for exaltation, and is it returning? But it remains subject to interpretation among modern authorities.
And this is decades after the infallibility doctrine was supposed to settle all such debates by establishing institutional consistency.
That's right.
So if we step back and look at the whole picture, we see two major competing theological ideas. On one hand, the eternal, essential nature of polygamy.
And on the other, the unchangeable, unassailable nature of the current prophet.
And when these two ideas met the harsh reality of the Edmunds-Tucker Act, the doctrine of prophetic infallibility won. It had to win for the institution to survive. And it became the functional core of authority moving forward.
So, to summarize our deep dive, we've established a clear historical timeline. The claim that the prophet can never lead the church astray was not an original tenet of the faith.
Yeah.
It was introduced by Wilford Woodruff in 1890 precisely to manage the massive cognitive dissonance and institutional trauma caused by reversing 40 years of core essential doctrine concerning polygamy. It prioritized institutional survival above all else.
And this brings us back to that crucial spiritual tension that's highlighted in the material. The importance of reevaluating the foundation of your own personal faith.
Exactly.
Is your conviction rooted in institutional loyalty, a doctrine that was born out of necessity and crisis in 1890? Or is it rooted in personal spiritual confirmation and individual revelation, the very principle explicitly advocated by Joseph Smith and Brigham Young before the crisis?
Our source material suggests a profound domino effect here. It articulates that one false idea leads to another false idea. The unwavering teaching that polygamy is essential for exaltation, a claim that was later reversed, necessitated the creation of the doctrine of infallibility to justify its abandonment.
So the foundation of necessity gave birth to the principle of absolute unquestioning authority.
It did.
And that raises our final provocative thought for you, the learner, to carry forward. When tradition is used to justify a monumental change, when the current authority declares its own inability to err in order to cover for the reversal of a previous teaching that was presented as eternal, how can we discern the foundation of truth from the foundation of institutional necessity?
And we would encourage you to continue seeking that personal confirmation, to exercise discernment concerning all principles, past or present, and to remember the warnings of those original prophets against the spiritual danger of what they called reckless confidence.